Okay, this image right here has been sitting on my screen for a couple of days now. You can see that strand of yarn stretched between the needles, and if you knit English style or if you flick, that probably looks familiar. But what's actually happening here? Is the yarn being stretched? Is it loosening the tension? Or is this just what flicking looks like in slow motion? And today I want to take a closer look at what's really going on here. Hi, my name is Taylor, and today I want to share with you an email that I received from a viewer named Michelle. Michelle asked a question about the technique of flicking, which is a variation on the English style technique of knitting, and it sent me down quite a rabbit hole. Her email really got me thinking, and what she noticed and mentioned in her email was that when she sees people flicking or flick knitting, usually in tutorials, they often seem to, and I'm using her words here, pull their knitting apart, like they're stretching the yarn between the needles. And she wanted to know if that means loose tension or if that technique could impact her gauge one way or the other. And honestly, I had to think about it because I'm a flicker too, and I really wasn't exactly sure what she was talking about when she was talking about pulling the knitting apart. She provided two examples for videos in the email that she sent me, and she even put some timestamps there so that I would really know where to look to see what it was she was trying to explain. And she did mention in her email that if it wasn't clear what she was asking, that I could get in touch with her to kind of figure out what it was that she was referring to. But after watching the videos that she included, it started to become fairly obvious what it was that she was referring to. And so in order to get that clarity, I really needed to watch closely these videos that she provided and slow things down quite a bit. Plus, I also picked up a sock that I'd been working on to see my own hands working through the motions to see if I could find out exactly what my hand is doing in terms of the mechanics that might look as if I'm pulling my knitting apart or stretching, and if it is something that's lasting or if it's temporary as part of the process. Now, before we get to Michelle's question, I think it's important to talk about why people turn to the technique of flicking in the first place. Most of the time it's about efficiency. Flicking keeps your working hand anchored to the needle, at least for the most part. In my particular way of flicking, my working hand, which is my right hand, does stay pretty close to that needle, but occasionally my hand lifts away from the needle to provide a fulcrum of sorts in some other place. But I'm not completely locked onto that working needle 100% of the time, as some flickers are. I definitely feel like the way I do things is more of a hybrid between typical English style knitting and flicking, or at least I do relinquish some of that control over the working needle when I do it. And I do notice that with a lot of other flickers as well. But generally speaking, flicking allows that right hand to stay pretty close to the working needle the entire time. So it means that you're moving your wrist less. The whole process is kind of like tightening the circuit. You have less movement, less distance for your hand or yarn to travel, which means ultimately less fatigue. You can go longer, and most of the time you can move a little faster. It also tends to even out your tension because your yarn feed stays very consistent. But if you slow it down or film it up close, the movement looks way more exaggerated than it actually is. And I think that that's part of what Michelle picked up on, especially as someone who's trying to venture into a new technique and watching lots of tutorials and really wanting to look closely at what's happening. You are going to be watching slower and with a more kind of slowed down perspective, if you will. And anytime you slow something down like that, it does always over exaggerate what it is that you're seeing, which can be misleading in terms of how this works in the grand scheme of things. Okay, so here's what Michelle wrote. Hi. I'm a viewer of your podcast on YouTube, and I had a question for someone who knows more about knitting than I do. That's a lovely thing to say, but that's not necessarily true here. I typically like to knit English style, but recently started switching to flicking. Now I'm finding that I'm probably tensioning my yarn too much, which led me to watch a bunch of people flicking on YouTube. One thing that I keep seeing, regardless of the style of knitting, is some people on tutorials will knit, but they'll pull their knitting apart, stretching the yarn out in between the needles. So say if I aim to knit that way, is that considered loose tension? If I knit that way with my regular way of tensioning, what's most likely to happen to my gauge? Now, she also provided two example videos here as well, which I think are really important to provide context here. Okay, the first one that she includes is called How I Knit Fast Using the English Method. It looks like it's about 11 minutes long, so I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I want to focus on this part right here.
Finger These are controlling how many stitches I have next. It's really hard to do this on a camera. Even though I have a better setup than in my last video, this is still very difficult because I'm reaching around the tripod.
Now, I think that's really important to note that what she's saying here is that she's reaching around a tripod. It's really difficult to do this with a camera. So her movements are going to be a little bit more exaggerated and not as tight and close, compact as they would be if she had no worry about filming this for a tutorial.
So apologies if the focus isn't 100%.
Okay, so right here, we can already see that the needles are kind of pulled in such a way that the fabric in between the right and the left needle is pulling just a little bit. But I don't think this is exactly what she was referring to, so I'm going to let it play through just a little bit.
Apologies.
I'm getting closer. Let's slow this down. I'm going to mute this as well, just so that it's not an awkward sound. Okay, here we can see where the fabric and the yarn gets stretched out. Right in this area here, you can see this little strand, which is the strand between two columns of stitches. And it is being pulled. And we also see that the yarn is being tensioned over the index finger here, as it should be, to provide that your normal knitting tension. And everything looks very pulled, very taut. I'm going to pause it right here. Now you'll notice that at this point here, she's working this needle in and out of the stitches on the left needle, almost like a piston, okay? It's going in and out. And as she's doing that, she's wrapping her working yarn using her index finger. This point right here, that working hand pulls back ever so slightly to maneuver the needle around the left hand needle. It has to go from behind it to in front of it, from behind it to in front of it. And that maneuver kind of has the needle working like a piston, and it opens the fabric up ever so slightly, especially in a really cropped in view like this and something that's being done slower than typical. It's exaggerating that motion a little bit. And so we're getting very natural stretching happening right here. I'm going to keep it going. We're going to actually slow it down even more than we're watching it right now, and see if we can notice. There, it's in front. It goes back and in and out and back. So in, out, and back in again. And that contraction where it comes back in and then the stitch becomes seated on the right hand needle, that lets us know that the stitch is not permanently stretched. There was a momentary stretching of the fabric and of the yarn as the needle pistoned itself around the left hand needle, but once the stitch is finally seated on the right hand needle in the position where it's going to rest until it's knit again, it is back to its normal tension. It's not permanently changed. This is what I was thinking as I was watching this. As I was doing it myself, I was running through the motions and trying to figure out, well, what exactly is happening that might show her a stretching of the fabric, because as I thought about it in my mind and visualized myself knitting, I don't find that there's any stretching, because to me, my needle tips don't separate from one another very much at all. And I think that's because it is such a quick motion. But when I really slow it down, and I'll show you here, I'll pop an image or a video of me doing this, you can start to see that for a moment, your hand goes back as a reset and then begins to work again. And there's this very brief period of time where that fabric in between the two needles looks as if it's being stretched. Okay, I want to show you the next video that she sent in. And this one is called How to Knit Flicking Style. This is just a short, we're going to watch the whole thing here. Right here is a really good place to stop, because I feel like right here you can definitely see some stretching happening between the two needles right here. There is a little bit of a fabric stretch going on. And because this is exaggerated and really slowed down, I should say it's not exaggerated, but because it's shown slowly, it looks exaggerated. This could be seen as an unnecessary stretching. But there is a moment right after this of contraction where we have the needles coming back, the fabric coming back to the neutral state. Here. We're in. This is very slow and very exaggerated. I'm wondering, is this showing on the same rate of speed? No. Okay, just making sure I'm not watching this the same rate of speed as the other one. Off. Again, we have that pulling as the hand moves back to reset the position of the needle. We have that pulling motion right here. We're going to watch this again. She's showing how she positions her yarn. In, wrap, pistoning the needle out, and then it's going to come off. And then there's this momentary stretch happening here. She actually specifies in her email, she says 15 seconds to 16 seconds between the two needles is a good time for an example. So if I scrub to 15 seconds, which is actually exactly where we are, this is exactly where we are, 15 seconds. And you can see that she's referring to this stretching that's happening right here. And it's really interesting because I never would have noticed this in my own knitting, but when I do this now, and I was doing it just a moment ago, this absolutely happens. There's this momentary stretching of fabric as you position your needle to make your next stitch. In my opinion, this kind of stretching is exaggerated intentionally because the knitter here is really trying to show you what's happening between her needles. She wants you to see what's going on. She needs to get her hands out of the way. And in order to get her hands out of the way, it's going to pull the fabric apart ever so slightly. However, there's contraction that happens immediately after this. We go in, wrap, momentary stretch happening here, and then back. This one is interesting because I do feel like there's less contraction happening here. There's big time stretch right there, I noticed. So we go in, wrap, the needle comes out. There's some stretching happening here. There's some distortion of this particular stitch that's about to come off of the left needle, just ever so slightly. It's kind of being opened up. Now remember, this person is filming around a tripod. She has a tripod in front of her and her arms are working around the tripod. So you have to kind of take that into consideration. I think that's an important thing to note when you're watching a tutorial. Off, and then here, if you see here, this to me is a very exaggerated amount of stretch. When I work on my knitting here, and I'll pop that same video up of me doing this just before I started filming here today, I don't get that kind of an exaggerated stretch. But again, if I'm sitting here just doing this on my own, I'm not trying to show my knitting on a camera. So there is absolutely not, in my opinion, an exaggerated stretch. However, I will tell you that I do notice that there is some stretching of the fabric as I do this. That piston motion of my needle going in and out of the stitches definitely provides a little bit of a stretch. But see, this takes us, I'm having fun working on those. I need to pull these out more often. This takes us to the big question in Michelle's email, in my opinion. In Michelle's email, what she's asking, and she says it this way, if I knit this way, am I going to change my tension or my gauge? And this is the crux of it. This is where it really starts to be important, because if you're taking on a new knitting technique, you really want to make sure that your gauge isn't going to be thrown off too much from what you're used to. However, if it means that it's going to even out your tension and make everything more consistent, that's always a win. But I think what Michelle's asking here is this going to affect my gauge? Am I going to become a loose knitter? But here's the thing, that small brief moment where the yarn and the fabric right there looks tight, it doesn't stay that way. And I believe this is the key thing. And this is just based on me theorizing right now after looking at the video and looking at my own knitting, because I don't believe that I am a loose knitter. This is all very consistent tension right here. This is a size 2 knitting needle and Patton's Croy sock yarn, which tends to be bordering on a sport weight. And this is all very nice and consistent. I wouldn't consider myself a loose knitter. However, I am noticing a very similar thing happening to the yarn as I see in the video. However, it's far less exaggerated. But the thing is that the yarn, once seated on that right hand needle, doesn't stay stretched. It contracts back to the size, its original size that it's intended to be based on what it left. So it left the left hand needle a certain size, maneuvered itself over to the right hand needle, and some things are happening to it, a little bit of stretching, a little bit of contraction, and what's the opposite of contract? Expansion, I think, is what I'm looking for. But what I'm saying is that when the stitch goes from the left hand needle at the particular size that it is, and it maneuvers over to the right hand needle through the flicking process, there is a moment of expansion, which is what you're seeing there with the stretching as that needle pistons its way around the left hand needle, and then it contracts again to be seated on the right hand needle back in its normal size. Because that expansion does not last and it does eventually contract back down after the maneuver is completed, we aren't going to have any kind of a significant impact to the gauge. That's my theory. I believe that gauge isn't about what your yarn is doing in motion between being a sitting stitch on the left hand needle and an active stitch in the midst of all of it, and then a seated stitch on the right hand needle. It's where it's seated and how it lands in that position that's going to overall impact the gauge or the tension. If you stretch a stitch and you leave it stretched by keeping your hands wide or never letting that expanded stitch contract again, that would loosen your gauge. And a good way to imagine this is knitting from a size 2 needle onto a size 8 needle. Where it sits on that new size 8 is going to be a larger diameter. So that means that the stitch has to expand around the diameter of that needle permanently, because it has to be able to fit that larger needle. So once it goes from the smaller needle through the process of being knit onto the larger needle, that is a permanent change in tension, because now the stitch is sitting in it's taking up more space in its seated position. Now, we're really nerding out on this and we're really diving in, but I think it's a fantastic question to ask, because if you're venturing into a new technique of knitting, you kind of want to know these things. You want to know what's going to happen, what you can expect. And Michelle's already diving into that with her questions here. And I think this kind of starts to pick away at what's really happening in some of these tutorials. Okay, so I took some still shots of the YouTube short video that I showed you here, and I want to kind of walk through what we're seeing happening here. So this first one here, this is the first image of the process that she shows, and I'm going to call this the neutral setup, okay? We have the setup, everything, the yarn is tensioned, we're calm, we're compact, everything is ready to go. It's very neutral, not a lot of stretching or expansion going on here. This next photo, you're going to notice that the finger extends because the flick is beginning. That index finger here is straightening, creating visible tension. That's what you want. You have to have tension. People who think that tension is a bad thing in knitting, I think it's a kind of a misnomer. It's a misinterpretation of what that means. You have to have tension to get the stitches to be consistent and not loosey-goosey, okay? So this tension that you're seeing here is important. Nice, visible tension. Nothing's being tugged too much. It's just tensioned nicely over the index finger. Now this third picture here, this is where you're gonna have maximum control over that stitch before you plop it over onto the other needle to be worked later on the next round. Okay, and then we move to this fourth image. This is release. As soon as this stitch starts to slide off, you notice that that tension just vanishes. I wish there was one more stitch worked in this video to show kind of really how the hand comes back down, to show that reset, but you can kind of get an idea in this last picture here of the reset. This is back to neutral. The gauge is unchanged. Now, again, and I think that's important to reiterate, when you're watching a tutorial for any technique in any handicraft or whatever that requires kind of close inspection so that you can understand how to do it, a tutorial is going to be slow. It's going to be very close up, and slow motion and very cropped in scenes like that are going to emphasize and exaggerate everything that's happening. So a little bit of expansion happening with the stitches is going to seem like it's a full-on stretching, maybe even an intentional stretching by the knitter. And that's not necessarily the case. It's very deceiving. And I think that's at play here, at least in part, when it comes to what Michelle is experiencing when she's watching these videos and trying to learn more about flicking. It just kind of reminds me of so much of knitting happens faster than our eyes can really register. Sometimes you actually have to film yourself to really see what you're doing. And I mean, like anybody, grab your phone and just film yourself knitting, drop it down to slow motion and watch what happens. Those of us who think that our knitting is so fast and efficient are probably correct. but they're probably surprised when they realize just how much expansion and contraction is happening within that really efficient movement. And I think for me, that's part of what makes flicking so interesting. I really do, especially with smaller stitches. Flicking is great, but with smaller stitches and on smaller projects, I can really anchor my hand to the right needle more than others. When I'm using a larger needle, I tend to release my right hand from my needle. Now I'm going to show you, there is a point where you're going to notice my fingers here, these ones wiggling around, they will release. I'm just going to do it here. So I'm actually going to try to do this just down here because it makes it easier for me. But I wrap, just watch these little fingers right here. Let me get it going. Let me get ready. Here we go. Oops, I missed it. I'm looking at my camera to see if I can see it. It's very brief. These fingers, my ring and my pinky finger, hold onto the needle almost the entire time. It's my middle finger that will release every so often. The larger the needle I'm working on or the heavier the yarn, the more release I have. But, oops, see, now I'm getting nervous because I'm doing this in front of you. But overall, it's quite an efficient process in my opinion, but it is kind of amazing that it can still look very exaggerated when you slow it down, something that you think is so elegant and efficient and tidy. Michelle, thank you so much for your question. I really love diving into this. It caused me to slow down and take a look at something I've been doing somewhat mindlessly for years now. I hope this provided a little bit of insight into what's going on here, and I would definitely encourage you to keep trying if you find that this is a more efficient approach to knitting. And for anybody who feels a little, I don't know, discouraged at the rate of knitting, and maybe your knitting speed is not where you would like it to be, give flicking a try and see if it's for you. It is absolutely not for everybody, but I would invite you to give it a try because it absolutely changed knitting for me. It's almost like 9.5 years ago when I started doing it, and I've never looked back. I just absolutely think it's fantastic. If you have questions for me, if you have ideas or topics you would like me to explore, shoot me an email. My email address can be found down below in the description box. I love receiving topics, video ideas from you guys. Anything you'd like me to explore, it is greatly welcomed. So don't miss out on an opportunity to do that if there is something you'd like me to dive into deeper. I would also like to invite you to head over to Patreon for the after show. It's a short one, but I have a proposal for those of you who might be interested. That would be a really great way to dive into what knitting looks like, what our own personal knitting looks like, and all the various different ways that we knit our stitches. Head over to Patreon. It's all cleared up and clarified over there for you, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I would love to dive even further into this topic. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. Until we meet again for Thursday's episode, happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.